Do not fear, only believe. Boy, these words of Jesus jumped right out at me this time around. I believe that this is the first lectionary repeat of my preaching career, such as it is. I preached on this set of texts back in 2021, and I think it was only the second sermon I had ever preached here at St. Paul's. The neat thing about the lectionary and about our liturgies in general is that they may not change, except for every once in a great while, but we definitely change, even from day to day. And the world in which we live certainly changes, doesn't it? And so each time, even if, for example, we pray the offices every day, the experience is different. Each time we get to grow a little. Each time the Spirit has more to teach us, more truth to lead us into. And so last time in 2021, Jesus' command, "Little girl, get up," caught my eye. This time, another specific phrase of Jesus really grabbed me. Do not fear, only believe. It feels like one of those moments. Have you ever locked eyes with someone in a crowded room? In the midst of the bedlam and the noise and whatever else is going on, you had this connection with just one other person. That's what that feels like to me here in the story of Jairus. And of course, there is the other story interwoven, that of the woman with the issue of blood. Mark gets us right into her head, her background, her sad condition and tragic circumstances, her motivation and reasoning. We can empathize with both of these individuals, and we even get to experience with them the powerful encounters they have with the Lord. This story of Jesus' authority over death itself and of the pure power that exudes from him is actually the third in a trio of stories in Mark that are connected by a few common threads. Power, fear, and faith. Last Sunday, we read the first story in which Jesus and his disciples set out across the Sea of Galilee and are caught up in a terrible storm, a dark and stormy night, as Father Larkin pointed out. Fearing for their lives, they cry out to Jesus, who merely says to the raging elements, "Peace, be still." And Mark says that the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. The disciples are absolutely flabbergasted and merely ask, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?" The second story in the trio, and I probably said this back in 2021, and I will probably say it every time I preach on this set of lectionary readings. The second story in the trio is actually not in the lectionary, unfortunately. We are reading the third story today. The second story is about when the boat arrives at the other side of the lake, in the country of the Gerasenes. And as soon as they get out of the boat, they are confronted by a man howling and naked, running at them. Jesus asks him his name, and he replies, "My name is Legion, for we are many." You may have heard this story before. Jesus, with merely his permission, allows the demonic forces afflicting this man to leave him and enter into a nearby grazing herd of swine. The disciples had just witnessed Jesus' divine authority over the chaotic forces of nature, and now they have seen that even the unclean spirits, an equally fearful force in the mind of the ancient person, acknowledge his authority and obey his will. In the third story of this Markan trio, Jesus, with authority and calm assurance, moves through the chaos of humanity, healing it with his touch and transforming it with his word, and demonstrating dominion over illness and death. And Jesus' manner through all three of these stories is so counterintuitive to us, so incongruent with the clear and present danger of each situation, that when we read that the mourners laughed at Jesus, we may at first feel the urge to be on Jesus' side and say, they shouldn't laugh at Jesus. But if we're honest with ourselves, yeah, the way Jesus acts in these situations doesn't really make sense to us, does it? He's asleep in the middle of a howling storm. And speaking of howling, a howling lunatic comes running at him, screaming, and what does he do? He asks him his name. A little girl is on the brink of death, and he stops in the middle of the crowd and asks, "Who touched me?" Why is Jesus' conduct in the midst of these intense, dramatic, and scary situations so different from the way any one of us might act in similar scenarios? The answer lies in that simple statement I mentioned earlier. Do not fear, only believe. Recall those three threads I mentioned that run through these three stories. The power at work in the Lord is manifestly present in each, as we have seen. But what about the other two threads, fear and faith? Fear is also a clear factor in each of the stories, as I've alluded to. Fear at the sheer helplessness one experiences in the face of the awesome forces of nature. The horror that we feel when we come face to face with the evil that is at work in the world, whether demonic or no. The terror of our frailty and mortality, especially painful when it seems unfair, when people are afflicted with a chronic disease, or when a young child suffers and dies. As these three stories show us, as if we needed reminding, there is a lot for all humans, Christian or otherwise, to be afraid of. And that leads us to the third thread running through these stories, faith. As a plot element, it's somewhat elusive and even enigmatic. Jesus himself is the only one who seems to exhibit it strongly or consistently. In the first story, the disciples simply freak out in the face of a monster storm, and Jesus asks them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" In the second story, there is merely the desperation of someone completely, utterly, and helplessly oppressed. This man has no agency until he experiences liberation. After that, there is faith. Mark tells us that he wants to be a follower of Jesus. There is similarly complete desperation in the story we read today. Although there is agency on the part of the father desperate to save his little girl, and on the part of the woman utterly ruined spiritually, socially, financially by her medical condition. And in another development of the theme, Jesus deems it fit to call these acts of desperation faith. He says to Jairus, "Just believe," which I take to mean, just keep trusting that I can do this. Don't listen to all these naysayers. And he does, and his daughter is brought back from the dead. And more explicitly, after the woman, out of complete desperation, surreptitiously touches Jesus' cloak, thinking that she will be healed in doing so, and is caught in the act, Jesus says to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed." We see in this story of two desperate people a definition of faith that is more or perhaps deeper than intellectual belief. Neither of them made any kind of verbal acknowledgement of Jesus' divinity or even his messiahship. In fact, as a leader of the synagogue in Capernaum, Jairus was probably risking the ire of the Pharisees, who were outraged that Jesus had healed a man in that synagogue on the Sabbath earlier in chapter 3. This faith that they have in Jesus might even be described as precognitive. They are impelled, or even like the Gerasene demoniac, they are driven to Jesus. He is their last and only hope. They don't know how or why, but they sense that Jesus may be able to help. And so they step out. In faith? Well, in a way, it is the faith of desperation. As I said, these stories remind us that there's a lot of stuff we humans have to be afraid of. We are also reminded of this in the daily news. The world, our country, is an anxious place in an anxious time. On top of that, we all experience our own challenges, our own overwhelm, our own storms, our own diseases and brushes with death, both physical and otherwise. There are a lot of voices telling us to despair and to simply freak out. But there is Jesus. In the middle of the crowd, he locks eyes with us. In the midst of the cacophony, we clearly hear him say, "Do not fear, only believe." Jesus presents us with this choice. We can choose to give in to fear in the face of very real and imminent peril. We can allow ourselves to be subsumed into the crowd, or we can listen to Jesus' call to faith. We can grab his hand, and although we can't see through the crowd, we can trust him to guide us. Of course, all of this applies to all people, not just Christians. We are all in that same boat, tossed about by superhuman forces, and all are likewise called to not fear, but believe that there is something greater than all the dangers we face, both big and small, corporate and personal, that God is not only greater and more powerful than these forces of chaos, but God is also in the midst of it all with us. If we Christians can hear that voice saying, "Do not fear, only believe," if we let go of fear and follow Christ, people will notice. Think about how much fear is at work in our society. If we were to let go of that, if we were to actually walk in love, if we were to love our enemies, I think the world would be confused, yes, and some would definitely laugh, but it would be so out of the norm, especially in this time and place, that it would cause people to wonder what makes us different. And when people get a glimpse or hear a rumor of what Jesus is like, they are drawn to him, as Jairus and that woman were. But there is that if. The trio of stories has a sobering epilogue, which we'll read next week. I will leave it to Father Larkin to preach about it, but I just want to point out that after exhibiting divine authority over the powers of nature and of the supernatural, and even over death itself, Jesus will seem to have met his match when he returns to his hometown and confronts the banality of the unbelief of the citizens there. Mark says he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few people and cured them, and he was amazed at their unbelief. Our faith, our willingness to trust in Jesus and to follow his way, is somehow the vehicle for his transformative power. And it can all too easily be blunted by our tendency toward distraction and busyness, our temptation to domesticate his message of radical love for our enemies, our desire to rationalize our own habits of fear and lack of faith. We mustn't allow all this to drown out that call on us. Do not fear, only believe. Like homing in on a single sound in a noisy room or holding on to a hand in a crowded place, we've got to keep our focus on this call. I want to close with a meditation on the power of this faith from an early 4th century father of the Syrian church who writes, When the chief of the synagogue asked him about his daughter, Jesus said to him, "Only firmly believe, and your daughter shall live." He believed, and so his daughter lived and rose. So let us draw near then, my beloved, to faith, since its powers are so many. For faith raised up Enoch to the heavens and conquered the deluge. Faith causes the barren to sprout forth. It delivers from the sword. It raises up from the pit. It enriches the poor. It releases the captives. It delivers the persecuted. It brings down the fire. It divides the sea. It cleaves the rock and gives to the thirsty water to drink. It satisfies the hungry. It raises the dead. It stills the billows. It heals the sick. It conquers hosts. It overthrows walls. It stops the mouths of lions and quenches the flame of fire. It humiliates the proud and brings the humble to honor. All these mighty works are wrought by faith. This is the faith of the Church of God. Amen.